So, Suzi, thanks so much for joining us and agreeing to spend a few times sharing your insights with the Purposeful People community. Really great to have you.
Hi, Richard. It's awesome to be here, and hi, everybody.
So, hey, let's just jump straight in. I think the first thing would be introductions. It would be really good if you could introduce yourself to the tribe and perhaps give us a 1-minute self-portrait. So I like to say, in other words, who are you, what do you do, and why do you do it?
Awesome. So if you haven't already worked out from my accent, I'm a Kiwi, which is usually a really good thing, except for in the last week or so we've had a few tremors. But
tremors. I think it's a huge tremor, right?
Yeah, that's an understatement. Actually, we had probably what is one of the biggest earthquakes in New Zealand history on Monday, and I'm smiling and laughing, but actually it's pretty serious. We've had loss of life, and we've also had people lose their homes. I live in Nelson, at the top of the South Island, which is really close to the epicentre. So, in fact, we may get some tremors today. And if you see me disappear, I've jumped onto the desk. But back to your question, I'll come back to that because it's really useful for actually what we're going to talk about today. I'm an executive coach. Leadership blogger. I write a blog called The Leaders Digest, which you know about, and I travel New Zealand working with chief executives and leadership teams on this thing called leadership. I'm one of those people that you hate at cocktail parties who say, I've got the best job in the world. I love this concept of leadership. I love learning about what happens when there's great leadership in action and what happens when it's absent. I was saying to my friend the other day that I'm about as interested in leadership as some of my friends are in shoes, and that's saying a lot. So, yeah, it's me.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's great to hear somebody who's passionate about their job, right, about their role. I mean, that's part of the idea behind Purposeful People, right, is to know what it is that gets you lit up and then to make a big difference in that field. And I think that's exactly what you're doing by the sound of it. So that's brilliant. So let's get back to earthquakes. So because I know you had some thoughts about what you lived through in that earthquake experience and about your subject, your passion subject of leadership. So how do you kind of bring those things together?
Yeah.
What's been going on?
So thanks. Yeah. So the last few days have been really scary, for a lot of Kiwis like myself. For anybody who's lived through an earthquake, and certainly the one of the same magnitude as we have, 7.8, which is massive. It's huge. Disasters tend to bring out, they're terrible things, and yet they bring out sometimes some of the most wonderful traits in humanity, and we've really seen that in action in New Zealand. So in the moments after the earthquake, in the days, I've seen some of the best examples of what we would term collaborative leadership in action. People coming together, diverse parties, diverse people, to accomplish goals bigger than any one of them could achieve on their own. Especially in, civil defence, in the rescue teams, in GNet, and different organisations working together. And even in communities, in my community, there's been some wonderful acts of what I call collaborative leadership in the way that people have, looked after each other. In Kaikoura, which is just down the road, which is kind of at the epicentre, they've been cut off. And the marae there has set up shop, and the fishermen have brought in some of the food and just even in looking after some of these people. So it's a hard thing living with an earthquake of that size, but it as I said, it talks about collaborative leadership, which is something that I'm really passionate about.
So what is collaborative leadership, and what's the kind of non-collaborative leadership that presumably there must be if you're talking about collaborative leadership?
Yeah, so a bit of context. I think if you look around the world in which we are leading and which managers are managing in and leaders are leading in, you look at globalization, the impact of technology, social media, we are more interconnected and more interdependent than we've ever been before. And yet, for the most part in organizations, we're still leading as if we're in the slow-moving, simplistic environment of yesteryear. And if you look at the leadership frameworks that we tend to be using, we have these sort of quite military-based command and control. We have this superhero archetype of leadership that we tend to look to, where it's the leader stands and commands and controls and protects their team members and tells them what to do and never shows any vulnerability and has all the answers and never makes mistakes. And when we look at the world in which we're leading, it's volatile, uncertain, it's ambiguous, it's complex. That sort of leadership style just ain't cutting it anymore. It just isn't working for the most part. So collaborative leadership is really around the emphasis is on leadership, not one leader. And one of the best ways to describe collaborative leadership in action is to think of a relay race. So if you can imagine, a relay race and a relay track, and if collaborative leadership was not in action, you would see the leader with the baton running around and around the track, never passing it, and here are his or her leader, her team members on the side, and you might have a fantastic sprinter, but she never passes the baton. She gets tired, but she feels like she's got to do the leading all on her own. Mm-hmm. Whereas collaborative leadership, if you could imagine, is that she would pass the baton. Mm-hmm. At a certain time, it might be, the sprinter might be needed, and she would recognise that, and she would pass the leadership baton to the sprinter. And so that would take on it. And so if you were to imagine collaborative leadership in action, imagine a relay race of the best imagination that you can in action. And that kind of is the metaphor for collaborative leadership.
So in a team setting, is that saying that kind of the decision making or leadership roles kind of move around the team, or is it saying that you're just aware of different people's strengths? I mean, how would you kind of in a kind of work setting or in a team setting, how do you see that?
How would you cast that? Yeah, that's a really good question. It's really about harnessing the leadership capability of the team. And it is really around trying to harness the power of the leadership of the team rather than just being completely hierarchical. A really good way to see that is, as you say, often in meetings, if we were to walk into a meeting and we were to see collaborative leadership in action and we were a fly on the wall, we would probably find it a little difficult to determine at first who the boss was in the room, because the group would be working. Yes. And the group would be determining what was happening. If you want a perfect example of collaborative leadership in action, I would suggest people that you look at Ray Chambers. So Ray Chambers and his team solved malaria, the issue of malaria worldwide, where millions of others had tried and billions had been spent. But Ray Chambers really demonstrated collaborative leadership, and so I would suggest you look at that as an example. And of course, the results are amazing. They have pretty much got rid of it in developing countries, or addressed it, and that was really through collaborative leadership. So it's harnessing the power of the team, and not only the team, but collectively, even your wider stakeholders. So crowdsourcing, for example, is a good example of collaborative leadership in action.
So I guess the question here is, how does this arise? How does this collaborative leadership arise, right? Does it bubble up because everybody's a leader and they kind of decide they're going to lead in their own way? Or is it that actually there is a leader who is kind of simply empowering in some way the team to work in this way? Because I suppose, one danger I can see is that collaborative leadership could almost become an excuse for no leadership, because I have seen meetings where the so-called, the boss, for want of a better word, is not actually stepping up to his role, and therefore things don't actually get decided, things don't progress. Everyone's talking, everyone's kind of contributing, but the machine is not somehow meshed together. It's not actually moving forward.
Yeah, it's a really big trap. So it's not an excuse for not taking the stand when it's needed. So transparency is really important. There are times when a collaborative approach is really important. So when you're trying to get creative, problem solving. Certainly in an emergency, this is not the time to be, you have to be authoritative. I mean, if the plane's going down and the co-pilot, the pilot says, oh, look, what should we do here? Let's collaborate. That's not going to work, right? So I think there are times when the manager or the leader needs to take a stand and say, this is the way we're going, and it's not going to be popular. So knowing when to do that and when not is really important. My experience is there's not enough of the collaborative. Right. There's too much of I decide and not enough of we decide. I think you need to look at this different situations and different scenarios and say, does this call for an I decide? Is it a we decide, or is it a you decide? But being very conscious and transparent about that. There are some tips about how to become a more collaborative leader, and I think some of the best ways to look at these are the villains of collaborative leadership. So there are villains of collaborative leadership. One of them is the unchecked ego. The unchecked ego, we all have egos, is one of the biggest. So one of the things you can do if you're a manager or a leader is to address that is to, if you're in a meeting and you've got a problem, almost always go last with your idea or opinion, or at the very least, don't go first if you are the one with hierarchical power. Because the moment you say, well, I think we should do this, people are, because of your authoritative power, people are going to sort of go, oh, well, yeah, that's what we'll do. So, encourage others to go first. Another tip is to have regular what-if brainstorming sessions. So scenario planning without boundaries is a really good way to encourage collaborative leadership. Villain number 2 of collaborative leadership is homogeneity. So one of the simplest ways that you can encourage collaborative leadership in your team is to encourage diversity. And we're not just talking about diversity of culture or of gender, but also diversity of thinking, divergent thinking, introverts, extroverts, age. So diversity in all its forms will encourage a collaborative culture. And one of the other villains is hoarding information. So not giving away any information. There are some sensitivities around financial information that, of course, that you need to hold on to. But crowdsourcing is a really good way of encouraging collaboration. Here in New Zealand, the tax department, the IRD, used crowdsourcing to launch their mobile app for small businesses. And I reckon if the tax department can be collaborative and crowdsourced, then pretty much anybody can. So these are just a few tips and tools for leaders to start to act in a more collaborative way.
Yeah, those are really, really practical. It reminded me of one thing that I try and do in teams, which is to kind of get a sense of the volume of people's voices in the discussion. I mean, just their natural propensity to speak, right? Because, often there's a few people like me who's pretty loud and going to be out there and are just happy to jump in the first into the discussion and be fairly opinionated. And yet, the danger, if you do that, you do shut down people who are either less willing to create controversy or they don't want to take a position that people might then disagree with, or people that just feel that if they haven't been asked specially and everyone is talking around them, and they're not welcome in the discussion. So I found that trying to actually, as you say, hold back, but also almost to invite people in reverse volume order, right? Starting with the quietest people to get them out first does tend to help. But it's a hard discipline, right? It's really hard to do, and you have to keep remembering, hold back, let the other people get their value out, and it becomes a lot better, and because everyone feels heard and everybody participates and feels committed to the outcome.
Yeah, I think, when you're the boss, your whisper comes out like a shout, so, I love what you're saying about getting the quiet voices out. So for anybody who's managing an introvert, here's a tip. Always give them time beforehand. So this is where asking a question before the meeting and allowing people to write it down. Other really good meeting facilitation tools would help as well. So things like structured rounds. So I'm going to go around the room and I want everybody to give me one answer. Or so, just general discussion tends to be, to your point, a way where you have the dominant extroverts in the room dominate the conversation. Yep. So as a manager, I would suggest, to your point, really getting good on group facilitation techniques for your meeting and trying different meeting structures to enable all of the voices in the room to be heard. Because as you say, sometimes the best ideas might come from the quietest.
Yes. Yeah, that's brilliant. So, Suzi, I guess our time's probably running out. Main question would be, how can people find out more about your work, leadership, especially if they're not living perhaps down the road from you, which I guess a lot of people might not be, given that you live probably the other side of the world for quite a lot of us.
Yeah, most of and funnily enough, the other day I've got more followers in the States now than we have here in New Zealand. Although come to New Zealand, it's an awesome place. It's an awesome place to live. Yeah. So probably what I would love is for you to all follow the Leaders Digest. It's my blog. You can find me on Twitter at Suzi McAlpine. The Leaders Digest is also on LinkedIn and Facebook. And the other thing you can do, it's free, is to download. We launched the first leadership app in New Zealand called the Leaders Digest app, and that's available on Android and on iPhone. And it's free, so download that. You get the Leaders Digest blog, and there's some really good tips and tools on how to lead better. But Richard, thank you so much for enabling me to come on, and thank you to your tribe. So thank you.
That's great, and I'll put the links to all those things in the show notes. But Suzi, thank you so much for giving your time so generously and having this chat, and hopefully we'll do it again pretty soon.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
Bye.